And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Jarreau, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called Look to the Rainbow, live in Europe, released in 1977. This was one of his best recordings for Warner Brothers and features one of his 1977 concerts in Europe. The album went on to win him a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance. This album sees him interpreting some beautiful ballads. Also, his scat singing is one of the highlights of the album. He's on top form as he takes us through some jazz classics like Better Than Anything, Look to the Rainbow and Take 5. On this album, he's joined by vibraphonist Lynn Blessing, keyboardist Tom Koenig, bassist Abe Laboriel, and drummer Joe Corriero. The album's great for two reasons: the amazing intensity of the music and the chemistry between Jarreau and his fans in Europe. All Fly Home is another Grammy Award-winning album, won him a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance in 1977. On this album, Jarreau is joined by a funk ensemble and a few top-notch players from the jazz arena. And he raps his mind-bending vocals along some great songs, the majority of which he wrote himself. There's also some great covers of songs like Wait a Little While, She's Leaving Home and The Dock of the Bay, featuring his trademark improvising and scat singing. And a song called Blue Ronda a la Turk, for which Jarreau won a Grammy for Best Vocal Performance Male in 1982. His cover of this song was very spirited and upbeat and stood out from the rest. The song was originally an instrumental that was typically played out as a piano, saxophone, bass and drum melody. In 1981, Jarreau added lyrics to the song when he performed it for his album Breakin Away. So that was a quick insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Jarreau, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Look to the Rainbow, live in Europe, released in 1977. This one's a great fusion album of its time. So in 1975, Jarreau released the massively successful We Got By, followed by 1975's Glow. And both these albums reached widespread popularity. His songwriting and singing talents were such a success during his tours that he made a live album compilation based on his performances there. He's joined by an all-star band, people like Tom Koenig on keyboard, Lynn Blessing on vibraphone and others. Also, his vocals are at their peak. There's also an emphasis on some of his original compositions. On the Leon Russell song Rainbow in Your Eyes, we get a glimpse of Jarreau's epic scat singing. Also on the song Better Than Anything. Take 5, a timeless jazz classic, features some great improvisations. The song's already complex twists and turns are given extra impetus by Jarreau's improvisations. Also a feature of this album is the audience applauding in the background, and that's one outstanding feature of this album. One gets to witness the magical chemistry between Jarreau's band and their fans in a live audience setting in Europe. It was one said of Ellington that he would draw inspiration from his music from a diverse range of styles and yet made it unique, something people call Ellingtonia. Jarreau had that ability also. His unique sound was a product of several styles and techniques. On this album, we see Jarreau portraying great vintage classics with a modernistic appeal. There's influences of John Hendricks themes, Duke Ellington and Dave Brubeck themes in the melodies. Also, this album also shows that Jarreau was both great in a live setting and in a concert setting. All Fly Home is another great album. This is another Grammy Award-winning album. He won a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance in 1978. On this album, Jarreau is joined by a funk ensemble and a few top-notch players from the jazz arena, and he raps his mind-bending vocals around some great jazz songs, the majority of which he wrote himself. Also, there's some great covers of songs like Wait a Little While, She's Leaving Home and Dock of the Bay, featuring his trademark improvising and scat singing. Fly is his own composition and features some Brazilian theme music. There's a guest appearance on the same track by Freddie Hubbard, also on the track I'm Home, where he plays very soulfully on the flugelhorn. Also, there's a background story to this album. At the time, Jarreau had seen a lot of commercial success in the US with his previous albums, but he wanted to take his music to a greater audience. The combined mediums of soul and funk allowed him to do this. The two genres were flexible enough to allow for the fusion of uncut jazz in the music. For example, the songs Thinking About It Too and Wait a Little While, with their abstract bass, synthesizers and powerful melodies, they also have a touch of pop influences in them. On I'm Home and I Do, he's in his element, scat singing and improvising to a blend of electric piano-based jazzy ballads that were perfect for his style. One of the most complex songs in the album is the song Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. Jarreau completely reharmonizes this song in a mashup of funk and jazz themes. So overall, this one's an album full of original compositions by Jarreau, with an emphasis on his vocal styles, bringing flavors of funk, pop and jazz together to create one mesmerizing album. The next one's a song called Blue Ronda a la Turk, for which Jarreau won a Grammy for Best Vocal Performance Male in 1982. His cover of this song was very spirited and upbeat and stood out from the rest. One of the highlights of this song is it's written with an unusual rhythm, a 9/8 time signature which is very complex and challenging. A time signature that the song refers to as Blue Rondo. The title basically refers to the influence of Turkish influence on the music and the use of blue notes commonly found in jazz music. Dave Brubeck, who originally wrote the song, was inspired to do so based on Turkish street performers who he'd seen performing the song. Story goes that he saw the musicians performing this song on the street, so he went up to them and asked them where they got the rhythm for the song from. They replied, "This rhythm is to us what the blues is to you." So when Dave Brubeck wrote that song, he used that line as an inspiration of the title Blue Rondo a la Turk. The song was originally an instrumental that was typically played out as a piano, saxophone and drum melody. In 1981, Al Jarreau added lyrics of his own to the song when he performed it for his album Breakin Away. Basically, the lyrics invite the listener to be drawn into the complexities of the melody and how it creates a fusion of jazz and classical themes. The lyrics start off by setting the scene with its unique melody, then takes the listener through a journey of mystery, passion and memories that the melody evokes. There have been many renditions of the song, but Al Jarreau's Grammy Award-winning cover of the song was ahead of the rest in terms of the playful energy and the vibrance that he brought to the lyrics. So that was a quick insight into some of Al Jarreau's best hits of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Al Jarreau, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending album news. The Best of Bublé by jazz legend Michael Bublé is trending on the jazz albums charts for this week. This one's a compilation of the Canadian singer's best hits. Bublé rose to fame in the 2000s for his ability to interpret jazz classics from the Great American Songbook in his own unique style. Also, he's made waves with some original compositions like Home, Haven't Met You Yet and Everything, which make an appearance in this album. And this compilation of music more than just delves into the past. There's also 2 unreleased songs highlighting his vocal range and versatility. The song Don't Blame It On Me is portrayed with a cheery note. In the backdrop are lively horn and acoustic guitar melodies. This one's a peppy dance track. Quizás, Quizás, Quizás is an upbeat Spanish theme song cover of a Cuban classic. Alongside those songs are some of his all-time favorite hits. Overall, a beautiful bossa nova album that takes a listener on a beautiful nostalgic journey. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Al Jarreau's best hits of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Al Jarreau, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we are going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called Accentuate the Positive. This album was nominated for a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance upon release. On this album, we see a glimpse of Jarreau's vocal prowess as he takes us through everything from beautiful ballads to toe-tapping dance tracks, coupled with his famous scat singing. The album sees Jarreau taking on a string of blues classics like Eddie Henderson's Cold Duck to lush ballads including My Foolish Heart and reworked standards. Al Jarreau and the Metropole Orchestra Live is another great album. This was one of his best albums recorded alongside a big orchestra, the Metropole Orchestra, and this album went on to win a Grammy nomination upon release. Together they take us through some lovely ballads and jazzy melodies. Glow was Al Jarreau's second studio album and was released in 1976. Most of the tracks like Have You Seen the Child and Hold On Me and the title track were written by Jarreau himself. This was one of his early albums and one that shone the spotlight on his mesmerizing vocals and propelled him to fame. And the Best of Al Jarreau, released in 1996. This one's a wholesome compilation of Al Jarreau's best hits for Warner Brothers. The album compiles jazz classics, ballads and his own compositions that became hit songs in later years. So this is a great introduction to Al Jarreau's music and a great hits compilation from his early days. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Al Jarreau, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Accentuate the Positive. This album was nominated for a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance. Al Jarreau was one of the most versatile singers of his generation. On this album, we see a glimpse of that as he takes us through everything from beautiful ballads to toe-tapping dance tracks coupled with his famous scat singing. This album basically features a mashup of songs taken from the 1940s. The album sees Jarreau taking on a string of blues classics like Eddie Henderson's Cold Duck to lush ballads including My Foolish Heart and reworked standards. Most notably, Accentuate the Positive, which plays out in the album as a funky dance track. His renditions of the songs in the album always preserve the original essence of the song, yet are portrayed with a lot of fiery dynamic energy. One of the highlights of the album is the song My Foolish Heart. It starts off soothing and gentle and then builds into a swinging piece of soul jazz. The album also features a stellar lineup of musicians from bassist Christian McBride to guitarist Anthony Wilson, some superb accompaniment from the instrumentals. The album was nominated for a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance upon release. Al Jarreau and the Metropole Orchestra Live is another great album. This was one of his best albums recorded alongside a big orchestra, the Metropole Orchestra, and this album went on to win him a Grammy nomination upon release. The Metropole Orchestra consisted of a horn and rhythm section and a string section. They back his unique vocals with beautiful backdrop instrumentals. Together they take us through some lovely ballads and jazzy melodies. Al Jarreau's scat sings beautifully, mimicking musical instruments with his voice as is evident on the song We Are in This Love Together. Same with the songs After All and Flame, which see Jarreau's haunting vocals perfectly complemented by the background orchestra. The background orchestra was conducted by the famous Vince Mendoza, and the instrumentals speak on the songs like Midnight Sun, a lush relaxing song, or the energetic rhythmic drives of the exciting Spain. Vincent Mendoza went on to win a Grammy nomination for that song for Best Instrumental Arrangement Accompanying Vocalist. Another album called Glow. This was Al Jarreau's second studio album and was released in 1976. Most of the tracks like Have You Seen the Child and Hold On Me and the title track were written by Jarreau himself. On this album, he's joined by other great musicians like Tom Koenig, Wilton Felder and others. This one's a diverse compilation of songs by Jarreau. Each song is sung differently. He improvises a lot on the song. Sometimes it's a melody that's sung differently, sometimes the rhythm. Two great covers on the title track, a mesmerizing rendition and Your Song. An album called The Best of Al Jarreau, released in 1996. This one's a wholesome compilation of Al Jarreau's best hits for Warner Brothers. The album compiles jazz classics, ballads and his own compositions that became hit songs in later years. Most of his earliest takes like Take 5 and Spain revealed his unique vocals as they were impressed upon the music world for the first time. An amazing rhythmic flexibility and an unpredictable approach to the tunes. Songs like Never Give Up and Roof Garden also bring a touch of R&B and pop to the table. Towards the latter part of his career, his vocals became less spontaneous and more complex, as is apparent on the feel-good song Morning. There's also guest appearances on some of the tracks by Bob James, David Sanborn and others. So this is a great introduction to Al Jarreau's music and a great hits compilation from his early days. Also a highlight of this album, it includes a song that Al Jarreau once performed for a TV show soundtrack, the TV show Moonlighting that saw popularity in the 70s. So Al Jarreau was a sensational singer, one of the best of his generation. He was also one of the first singers to win a Grammy in 3 different categories, jazz, pop and R&B. His style balanced smooth lyrics with scat singing, that's the art of mimicking musical instruments with one's voice. He emerged on the world stage in the 60s and audiences were drawn to his blend of jazz ballads and scat singing. By the late 80s, he'd won multiple Grammys and Grammy nominations for his albums. That was a bit of insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Breakin Away. This album propelled Al Jarreau to nationwide recognition. The album featured a mix of R&B and jazz songs and also saw him taking his amazing scat singing to a wider audience. Al Jarreau and the Metropole Orchestra Live was one of his best albums recorded alongside a big orchestra, the Metropole Orchestra, and this album went on to win him a Grammy nomination upon release. Together they take us through some lovely ballads and jazzy melodies. And All Fly Home. This was another great Grammy award-winning album, won him a Grammy for Best Jazz Vocal Performance in 1978. On this album, Jarreau is joined by a funk ensemble and a few top-notch players from the jazz arena. And he wraps his mind-bending vocals around some great songs, the majority of which he wrote himself. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.